Okay.
Yeah, it moves when a different person talks.
Yeah.
Okay, salam everybody. Um, we're back. Sorry for the technical difficulties. We actually started on time this time, but unfortunately we ran into some trouble along the way. So I wanted to check with the other people on the panel to make sure how we're doing with the screen. So right now it's my face, thumbs up or down, and then right now is it on Habib John or is it still on me?
On you.
It's still on me. Okay.
Hmm.
Uh, well, I will do my best to try and make it so that your people are, I'm not the only one that people see. Um, Usually that's not a problem. Um, so I think there was a discussion happening between Bilal and Soraya Jan. So if you two wanted to go ahead and kind of fill us in for those of us that missed it, please go ahead.
Sure. So during the break, I asked Soraya John if there was any part of her that thought that, you know, there was a possibility of any kind of positive outcome of the American invasion.
Right. No. Immediately, I was against the war. I intuitively knew that it would mean havoc, destruction, death, misery, and even more instability for the country. As well, if you look at even just America's history and track record and their military involvements in South America, Africa, parts of Asia, they don't really have a good track record to begin with. So, and also, combined with Afghanistan being in a strategic location, there was a lot of questions around their invasion and continuing occupation and war and what that would mean. Also, I think a huge factor now that I think about it is also Islamophobia, because when it happened, when 9/11 happened, uh, Islam suddenly became the center of discussion where people were talking about Islam and Muslims and if it was a peaceful religion or not. And me myself personally, I dealt with a lot of discrimination, not even from fellow students, but from the school staff, and giving me random locker checks, calling up my parents, and because I was actively involved in the Muslim Student Association, and I was very vocally outspoken against the war, I got a lot of flack for it. And so, yeah, these are things I think a lot of us had to deal with, unfortunately.
And I
Um,
want
oh, Ali John, we'll go to Ali John and then Nura John, sorry. We'll go to you right after.
I 100% agree with Sarejan. For me, I had a very negative outlook about the war from the beginning. I was highly critical of it, and it has gotten worse, I would say, my critique of it, rather than improving. And this stems fundamentally from the fact that I viewed this war first and foremost as an aspiring academic. I was 16 at the time, or maybe even younger, when this war started, and I looked at it from the perspective of how is this war being framed? And Islamophobia was raised, and to me, that's a very key factor here. We view this war in the United States, and we continue to do so within the broader context of the war on terror. And this is not, while we call it the war on terror, it's not a new thing. It's existed for many decades. And it's an Orientalist framing in which the people, the brown people that we target here in the United States, are reduced to a religious lens. So we look at the Taliban here in the United States and the framing of the war as a war against fundamentalism and extremism. We ignore the political factor, we ignore the social factor, we ignore the economic factor. We have failed to accept our own culpability in their rise. I mean, we talk about this war starting in 2001, but the Taliban were put in place by a project that funded extremists against the Soviet Union, and specifically the communist expansion into Russia. And so seeing that framework, seeing how we approached the war, seeing how the top brass, if you will, within the United States was looking at this, it was quite clear that not only were our motives questionable, American motives were questionable, but how we were going to go about this war was questionable. We can talk about liberation in the media, we can talk about trying to free Muslim Afghan women over there, but at the end of the day, we continued to view them as the other, as helpless people that needed white imperial American might in order to salvage them. And that fundamentally is the flaw. So long as we continue to view the war in that lens, it will never be successful.
And that was the point I was going to tally John's point about women specifically. I think that was the most attractive thing about the U.S. invasion was, oh, women can go back to school. And then you saw this sort of internal divide amongst at least the Afghan communities that I was a part of because of the fact that, like, oh, I have family in Herat. So once the U.S. came in, they were able to go back to school. So there was this issue of this paternalism of we're going to empower women, right, that occurred. And I always wonder now, even like, to what degree is the issue of women still sort of justify military presence in the sense that when we talk about people like Malala John and the work that she does, it's excellent work, right? But it's also utilized by people to be like, well, she's able to be who she is and empower people because we were there to help make that happen versus just like the big bad ugly Taliban being there, right? So how do we reconcile the role that women's issues have played in this entire conversation? Because I think for me that was the most salient thing I remember when the war came about was people being like, women will have opportunities now they didn't have before.
Sorry, Bilal, go ahead. And
Yeah.
then Ali John will get back to you. And then Ali John.
Thank you. I think this is really interesting, but I think we're kind of being a little disingenuous and being a little unnuanced in our when we're looking back, because from what I remember, there was actual serious optimism, right? There was actual optimism about what the war would bring, right? And or at least that that the Taliban would be gone, and that this new internet. It wasn't just this war; it was the entire world was looking at Afghanistan. I think we all remember when Afghanistan first returned to the Olympics, right? The entire world stood and cheered for Afghanistan, and so I think we're kind of forgetting about that optimism, right? And so this is, and that's a part of what the war meant for us. It was for and they were like Habib can tell us like how Afghans in Afghanistan were optimistic and kind of eager-eyed when people came in, and we can't just sweep that under the rug and say we were also we knew that it was going to be terrible.
If we can actually go to Habib John, because I don't think we've heard from you for a minute, and then we'll go to Ali after, and then Soraya.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that when the bombing started, even before that, there was so much optimism, there was so much eagerness, and as I said, people were saying that yes, the Americans will come, bomb the Taliban, kick them out of the country and out of power. And they're welcomed. And I remember when the Taliban left Kabul city, people were everywhere. They were playing music. My family was playing music, and for the first time, we could play music loud and we could dance. And wherever you would go, you would see people dancing, and they were happy. I remember the Afghan radio television, national radio television, had this one track with loudspeakers, and they would just stop in the middle of a bazaar, play music, and then everybody would dance. So I totally agree with Bilal that there was so much optimism. But I don't know how genuine that optimism was. Was that optimism really based on facts, or that was the result of too much propaganda and too much American jingoism and American promises that they made? And as I said, within 6 months to a year, a lot of things changed. People started questioning United States motives in Afghanistan. And I just wanted to make a couple of points that liberation of Afghan women, it was not part of the United States agenda. They didn't have a nation building program at all in their agenda. Their plan was to go to Afghanistan, bomb the shit out of it, kill Osama bin Laden or capture it, and then just leave the country. And the issue of the Afghan women, it came later when Osama bin Laden slipped through the Afghan-Pakistani border and went to Pakistan. And if Afghanistan, Afghan women's plight was the agenda of the United States, there were so many other women around the world, in the Muslim world, like Saudi Arabia, that the Americans could go and liberate them, but it didn't happen. There was other motives, other objectives that the United States wanted to pursue in Afghanistan, and over time, that optimism that we had at the beginning, it completely changed when the insurgency came back to the country and people started losing family and relatives in bombings and suicide bombings. People would not point their finger at the Taliban at Pakistan. I remember they would, even to this day, they point their finger at the Americans. They blame the Americans for bringing this misery on them. And when Americans claim that they went to Afghanistan to liberate women, just get rid of a misogynistic group like Taliban, how can they say that with straight face when they replaced one misogynistic group with another misogynistic group? I grew up, I remember the Civil War between 1992 and 1996. Women were gang raped, when women's breasts were chopped. So many women disappeared. Their husbands were killed, their brothers were killed. If you compare that with what the Taliban did to women, the Taliban's restriction on women was nothing. If you compare it with the crimes that the people that the Americans brought back to power committed against women.
And Alijan?
Yeah, I think the very important points were brought up. I think Bilal John is absolutely right in bringing up the sense of optimism, but I think that's a sense of optimism that was really centered on a view of the world that somehow we can bomb towards liberty and we can bomb towards making equality happen in the United States. And my pessimism or my critique, and it's not, I wouldn't say it's pessimistic because I do have hope, but my critique stems from the fact that that very framing is what we should have questioned from the beginning, and not everyone did. And eventually we came around to it, that the framing was not there, that the focus was if we somehow, and this is inherent not just in Afghanistan, in the war with Afghanistan, but in the wider war on terror, as well as the war in Iraq, that somehow if we can topple these regimes militarily, and when I say we, I refer to the politicians, if you will, right, who were acting in our name, even if we disagree. They said that if we can topple these regimes, it will all get better. There was not a nation-building plan involved. There was not a, what are the socio-economic factors here? What are the political factors that gave rise to these groups? There wasn't a focus on that. The focus was that somehow, if we can bomb them, we can change these regimes. And I think fundamentally the question comes down to, was that a tenable framework? And I don't think it was. A prime example is that we talk a lot about Malala, and she is a great example of the struggle women had to face against the Taliban. But we don't talk about Nabila. Nabila was a young girl in Waziristan whose entire family was killed by a drone strike in 2012, I'm sorry. She came to Washington, D.C., she came to Congress, and there was zero media coverage of her. There was no focus on her struggle. We cannot advance women's rights and equality in Afghanistan by subjecting them to drone warfare. And the drone warfare is not a later development. It is a direct byproduct of the very framework that instigated the war in the first place.
And Soraya John?
Yeah, going back to what Bill said about the optimism, I remember the optimism very well. I mean, I know many of us here said they were very critical from the word to begin with, and I think we were really speaking for ourselves. I know I was, but I remember that optimism very well, both optimism from inside the country of Afghanistan and in the Afghan diaspora, and even here in the Afghan Canadian community in Toronto. And it left me very frustrated and feeling very isolated, and I would, reach out to other Afghan organizations and cultural groups and to have a conversation and dialogue about this or to talk about it. And a lot of times I wasn't taken seriously because I was female, I was too young, or I was too westernized. And as the war went on, they kept repackaging the war, as it was mentioned earlier, from going in to fight off Al Qaeda and Taliban, and then to, promote democracy, or should I say enforce democracy, and then quote unquote liberate women, and then now it's it's train the troops. When Obama announced sending 3,000 more troops in 2009, I was fed up, and I was it just so happened I found a couple of other Afghans in California at the time who were also against the war in Afghanistan. We're like, you know what, we should start our own organization. We're not being taken seriously out, within our own Afghan organization or culture or groups. And on top of that, the talking heads mostly on the Afghanistan war were military officials, politicians, or media journalists, and no one was really hearing from the average Afghan voice. So we started our own, Afghan-led movement against the NATO-led occupation and war in Afghanistan. And sure enough, as we became more public and gained more publicity, we found other like-minded Afghans who were also getting fed up with the war. Some from the beginning, some who later on became, anti-war. And so I think it was like a working progress. For some, it happened right away. For some, it developed over time.
Reza, go ahead.
I may be steering the conversation in a different direction at this point, but I thought it was important to sort of say that well, first off, I was 11 when 9/11 happened, and so when the war was announced, I was far more focused on my Saturday morning cartoons than I was anything regarding the war. And that isn't meant to like make a funny joke, it's just to sort of describe the bubble that I was in at the time. But as I grew up, and I think as the war prolonged itself, it grew roots in Afghanistan, and it's there now. And so I think that a lot of the discussion about how optimistic we were feeling and how pessimistic or critical we may have been feeling at the very beginning of the war kind of leads to the next question of what can we do now that it's so entrenched? Because there's an entire economy that is in Afghanistan now that is dependent upon foreign aid. There is a currency of favors and bribery that is legitimized and backed up by that foreign aid, billions upon billions of dollars that are being poured into that country that isn't necessarily going to the people of Afghanistan, but is rather going to those who attend cocktail parties and trade pieces of land for people's lives. And I think that when we discuss the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, especially now in 2015, it's important to keep an eye on how we felt in the beginning, but it's also important to sort of modulate that with how do we solve the conundrum, the quagmire that exists now, despite our feelings of optimism in the beginning, and considering our feelings of cynicism and pessimism in the end. And I think that it's an almost impossible answer, so I don't want to burden anybody with it, but it is something to consider that I think is an outgrowth of all of this discussion concerning our optimism and our pessimism.
Thank you, Reza Jan. I think that was it's a good segue, because I think we have been focusing a lot on how we felt, and I think maybe it shows that I think a lot of us have to go look back a little bit and talk about how it all started and how it all began. And hopefully, this will be a continuing conversation that we have. But to shift it a little bit, how do we, a couple people ask, how do we help? How do we make a difference? I know Gina and Medina on Facebook were asking those questions. But I also wanted to ask that in the sense that we've already have Afghans, particularly from, in the West, whoever in America, who have gone over as translators, who have, sold their land. So, how do, Afghans from the diaspora help? Or, what does that help look like? And considering the fact that we have done these things and that we have worked as translators or, gone back to sell land or whatever else people are doing when they go back. So I don't know. I just wanted to kind of touch on that, which might be separate questions, but if anyone wanted to touch on some of those things. Habib-Jan?
Yes, I think the Afghan diaspora can do a lot for the country. You guys are in I have to be frank, in a very privileged position than most of the Afghans back home. One of the things that I saw that Afghan-Americans did was, they sent a lot of artists and musicians and singers, which is a very good thing. Our people, back home really need those things. We really need the singers, we need artists, everything. But there are more important things, there are more important needs which need to be met in Afghanistan right now. Like, we don't have enough number of good doctors, good engineers, good teachers, university professors. These are the things that we really need back home. And the Afghan diaspora, I mean, like, yes, I know you guys need to pay your bills. Yes, you have a lot of, expenses to meet. But if you really want to help us, those are the kind of people that we need back home. Professors, doctors, engineers, people who can train other Afghans just right there. We need, people, who could treat patients. Thousands upon thousands of Afghans leave the country for India, Pakistan, Iran, even Europe and the United States for, very basic medical needs that they have. And I'm sure there are tons of Afghan-American doctors and engineers as well, professors as well.
Reza?
I think that's an incredible point to make. The diaspora that left can return and provide services and resources that weren't there. There are a lot of doctors were trained in Afghanistan pre-Soviet invasion. It's not like Afghanistan existed in some collection of huts where there wasn't any innovation or progress. There were plenty of doctors in Afghanistan, but many of them left. And many other Afghans who were either born here or immigrated when they were children were educated in Western-style hospitals with Western-style medicine and technology. And they can bring all that experience here back to Afghanistan. And I think that's an important point to make. But I also think that there's a question to be asked of why isn't that happening? Why isn't that happening at all? What is stopping the Afghan diaspora for, 14 years now, from flooding Afghanistan? And is it the danger? Is it something inherent within the way that groups of Afghans, whether they're divided by class or ethnicity or piety, interact with each other? Is there a difference there? What is stopping Afghans for the past 14 years from flooding the country? Because I do have family members who have gone back to Afghanistan and helped, either as translators. I have an uncle who is an engineer working with the government there. But these are in fits and starts and spurts. They aren't sort of, the kind of droves that one would hope would go back. And I think there's a parallel to be drawn with other communities and cultures and societies that America did help rebuild their nations way long time ago, far beyond the memories of many people who are alive now. But Japan and Korea were instances where we did hurt them really bad, but we also helped them rebuild too. Europe is another example. After 1945, we helped them rebuild. Now, there are plenty of reasons why we have lost that legacy, and we screwed up Vietnam, we screwed up Kuwait, we screwed up Iraq, we screwed up Iran over and over and over again. But there are instances where America was able to help rebuild a nation, and a lot of those nations that they helped rebuild were homogenous in nature, whereas Afghanistan is not. And so there is something different happening in Afghanistan that maybe we haven't considered yet that is stopping us for the past decade and a half of flooding the country with our resources the way that Habib illustrated. And I'm wondering what that is.
And we'll go to Bilal and then Soraya.
I think this is a really interesting question because, like I said earlier, when Soviet invasion happened, when this this long war started in Afghanistan, a third of the country left, right? And that was unfortunately, it was the educated third of the country that could leave, right? And what happens to a country when you're left with people who don't have those professional skills, we've seen, right? And that's not to say that there weren't plenty of very good patriotic people who, doctors and things who stayed, but when most of them leave, the rest of the country, falls apart. And I think this question of why there aren't more Afghan diaspora goes back to privilege, to issues of Afghan society being extremely classist, and also obviously security, right? We as Afghan-Americans, we have this privilege of being American, of having the most powerful passport in the world, being a part of, or Afghan Canadians, or anyone from the Afghan diaspora, we are well off compared to our Afghan peers in Afghanistan. And so we get in this comfort zone where we don't think about it. And then also, in my own experience, I think, I went to Afghanistan. I didn't go as a translator. I went as basically a civil society volunteer. I worked for a research organization, and I was there for a year, the second time that I went after we left when I was a kid. And from my family, they were just astounded why I would choose to leave a decent job and make no money and go work in Afghanistan when all they could tell me was, it's not Afghanistan anymore. Those people who are in Afghanistan, they don't have our culture anymore. It's gone. They're all just influenced by Pakistan and Iran and all of this. And so I think it's issues of classism, because we as Afghan Americans, we come from those older Afghan families that were more privileged, and now we still in a lot of ways kind of think of them as not us. And I think we need to confront that as Afghan Americans, how our privilege and our bias towards the economically disadvantaged Afghans, how that still operates and influences what we do.
Soraya, John, go ahead.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think it's a combination of all those factors, but also just one thing we can do. I mean, Afghans in diaspora is one role we can play is being very, very keenly aware of the realities on the front lines, recognizing the existing roadblocks in Afghanistan, and working with Afghans living in the country on solving them, actually listening to them and working with them. I mean, one other thing that I can't stress enough is accepting that everyone has a different vision for alternative to peaceful solutions for Afghanistan. We all have something different we can contribute. And it's important that we accept this and learn to have more solidarity with one another and supporting each other. And I think one of the problems is just too much division and being, I mean, it's very easy to be critical and destructive of other people's opinions and efforts, but if we're going to talk about working together and having a united stance, we have to learn to accept our differences and work together constructively and really building an Afghan community. I think we're way too divided right now.
Soraya, John, actually, we'll have a FIFA. Go ahead.
I think one of the things that I did want to point out also is just the number of responses with people talking about, one of the things that keeps them from going back is security concerns, just because I see that popping up on the Facebook page as well. But one of the things that I also wanted to address was one of the things that I see a lot of, which is apathy. That some of us do feel so removed from that experience. There's a lot of my younger relatives or just people that I see in the community that were born and raised here, or did have a lot of really traumatic experiences, and they just kind of turn the other cheek, and how do we kind of address that concern? How do we address that piece? I always kind of come back to that piece of is honoring our legacies, honoring our ancestors, honoring our history, and I think that once we know that piece, we know how important it is. And it kind of draws to mind like Marcus Garvey's quote, people without the knowledge of their history is like a tree without roots. It's how do we build those roots here, and how do we kind of incorporate that piece in our community, and how do we also do that, like Soraya John was saying, within our privilege within the community itself, right? That many of us are privileged in different ways as well in terms of our religious background, or whether we come from a minority group, a majority group, whether you're Hazara or Uzbek, right? Those are kind of valid pieces as well, and kind of determine different ways that we experience war in our own histories as well. So I just wanted to give voice to that as well.
I wanted to, I think Khalil had something to say, but I wanted to take on some questions that were written on Facebook. Two things came up that I see popping up. One was just about the corruption that exists in Afghanistan with people that are there, and then also those of us that contribute to that from the U.S. That was a question that was brought up by Arun John. And then another question that's been coming up a lot is the role, like the role of Pakistan. And I know that there was recently some protests that happened within the U.S. about Pakistan's influence in Afghan politics and all that within the U.S. that happened. So either of those questions, if anybody wants to maybe touch on those and talk about those that have come up through the Facebook page, and give everyone a chance to address them. And we'll start with Habib John.
I think the intervening of Pakistan, especially their intelligence service in Afghanistan, that's a fact. No one can deny that, and by now everybody knows that. But that's the same mantra that we have been hearing for the last 14, 15 years. Anything that happens, people point their fingers towards Pakistan, and for a good reason. My concern is that by doing that, we completely ignore the fact that our own politicians, our own government, and our own people are responsible for some of that, what's happening in Afghanistan. And the issue of Taliban and any other insurgent group, it's not the problem itself. Taliban are not the problem. The problem themselves. They are just a symptom of a problem. There are so many socioeconomic problems that we have across the country, especially in rural area. How can the insurgency recruit 16, 17, 18-year-old guys? These were like 5, 6 years old when the war started, even younger. And now they carry Kalashnikovs and fight. They kill people. It's all because the insurgency pays them a better money. If not anything else, they give them a Kalashnikov, which gave them power. So, there are people who do not want a stable Afghanistan, and they will just they will use the opportunity that is given to them, and arm whoever they want and intervene in our affairs as much as they can. But for as long as we don't look at our own problems, at our own incompetency, and just blame Pakistan, I don't think that this problem will be solved.
Bilal, go ahead.
So I was one of the organizers of the protests at the Embassy of Pakistan in DC, and I think this is a very valid point, right? And this is something that I wanted to avoid, is that us protesting at the embassy of Pakistan was not just more finger pointing, right? One brown person finger pointing at another brown person, while the rest of the world just looks on at us like we're doing some kind of skirmish. The point was to hold a actual sponsor, an actual actor of violence responsible, right? So we have these peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban, but we're not having Pakistan there when Pakistan is actually providing state support. That seems like those peace talks are destined to fail. And it is a very valid point, right? Like, we should be holding our government, the Afghan government officials, American government officials, responsible too. But we can't deny that 70% of civilian casualties caused in Afghanistan in 2015 so far have been at the hands of the Taliban, and that is a United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan report that you can look up for yourself. So I don't think we should start creating false equivalencies either. Right? So the overwhelming majority of these people are being killed by the Taliban. The other fact, I think, point very quickly is just like, I think the importance of the discussion is that we should be doing what we can as Afghans in Afghanistan and Afghans in diaspora to get outside of this mindset of war, right? We have all inherited this war mentality. The kids in Kabul go around running with guns. We glorify violence, we glorify the jihad, but we don't talk about how to build peace. And I think that's why this discussion of living outside the war is so important.
And I believe Sarayajan and then Alijan.
Yeah, I think Bilal brought up some great points, but going back to what Habib said, I really could not agree more. He's 100% right. There's a lack of accountability and lack of monitoring where money goes. And when you look at why the Taliban are getting so many recruits and from these teenagers, I mean, at one point in time, the Taliban paid more than the Afghan police force. And so what we're seeing is a lack of empowerment of Afghans in Afghanistan. We're talking about people who are, many of whom are living in absolute poverty. They don't have food, they don't have shelter, they don't have security, they don't have health care. We should put more focus and resources, in my opinion, into community-based, long-term, sustainable development. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that. And we need to stop this reliance and dependency on NGOs and on other government workers. I mean, I'll give you an example. The Canadian International Development Agency was formerly called that CETA project. CETA was giving billions of dollars to go into Afghanistan and supposedly build schools and the thing is, when two researchers from my university went to Afghanistan 2006-2007 to find all these CETA projects that were getting billions of dollars of funding, all they found was an empty mud building with a sign. So we have to ask ourselves, where is the money going? And when these schools are being built, why are these schools empty? And for some of the people that you speak to in Afghanistan, they'll tell you, well, because these kids are too busy, they have to work, they have to make money, or they don't have access to the school. All the roads that were being built at the time were only being used by NATO vehicles. Roads weren't being built for local, regular Afghans. So we really need to put more accountability and monitoring where the money is going and empowering the Afghan people.
And Alijan, and then we'll start wrapping it up.
Yeah, I agree with what was said, but I think that there is an intersection here that we should be aware of. Holding Pakistan accountable versus holding the Afghan government accountable for its corruption and mismanagement of funds are not mutually exclusive. I think that you can easily point to the U.S. involvement, the involvement of Pakistan's intelligence services that continues to fund these attacks, as well as the corruption, as three key elements of a continuing problem. And this goes really right back to what Reza said. Reza was asking a very important question, is why isn't refugees returning? Some have, but not to the degree that we hoped. Why is it that post-war countries in the past and nations have been able to rebuild World War II is a prime example of this. And the main reason is because the war is not over. We are in a bizarre state of history. It's a unique war that is protracted, that has no clear military end, that has no beginning. Politically, it is a quagmire that the world is trying to figure out, and we Afghan-Americans or Afghans around in the diaspora are also trying to figure it out. It's hard to talk about corruption or hard to talk about changing narratives or even that glory, focusing on peace building when the skies are filled with drones. When you're afraid to go out because suicide bombing happens in Kabul, these are very serious questions. Now, we do need a shift in the narrative. That is important. But we first need to recognize that in order for these narratives to take root, in order for people to start to have value in things like equality and political sovereignty, that they have to have some sense of security. And you can do that by holding all three of these actors accountable. Those in the upper echelons within Afghanistan itself that are profiting from an unstable Afghanistan or who are putting their own self-interest above the interest of the nation. You can also hold Pakistan accountable for its continued support of insurgents, for funding and for training, as well as for the ideological root of groups like Daesh and the Taliban, as well as critiquing the U.S. involvement. And we're sending money to empty schools, right? These are all questions we can have, and these are all things that we can tackle. But I don't see them as separate, and I don't see them as necessarily exclusive. They can all be tackled together, hoping to change the narrative and bring about some form of national unity and narrative change.
So I had a question for Habib John. As someone who grew up in Afghanistan and who is now in the U.S., I'm curious to know your thoughts on just what it's like for you to hear Afghans from the diaspora talking about Afghanistan, having opinions on it. I don't know. I'm curious to know your thoughts about that. Because I think sometimes we are missing that piece of those who are from the actual country giving their opinions and giving their thoughts. And so I just want to know what your take is on that, how you feel about it.
What if I tell you guys that I'm so surprised by the level of your interest in Afghanistan? Like, this is not something that we hear back home. For us, you guys are living in this, bubble, privileged, Afghans, who, for us, you are the Afghans who use like six English word in 10 word, Dari or Pashto sentence, and people who don't care about Afghanistan. But it's really, really, really surprising for me that I see this level of interest among Afghan Americans, and that it makes me happy. And there's so many stereotypes about you guys back home, and hopefully people who watch this video and this conversation back home can change their minds about Afghan Americans. So for back home, there's this stereotype about Afghan Americans and Afghan Europeans that, well, the Americans came, invaded Afghanistan, this opportunity was created, and all these Afghan Americans or Afghan Europeans who can't get a job back home, they come to Afghanistan, they get all these jobs from the Afghans who live back home, or they come to Afghanistan not because they love the country or because they want to the Afghans back home, but just to make some money and leave. And I think they have good reasons for thinking like that, because some Afghan Americans and Afghan Europeans did that. I've met Afghan Americans and Afghan Europeans in these Kabul parties where they have even refused to speak in Dari or Pashto with me, whereas they could fluently. I knew them. I've seen them speaking fluently in Dari, either on the phone or with other friends. So there are these stereotypes, but I'm so happy to see you guys doing this and showing this much interest, which makes me very hopeful.
Thank you for that. I think I think we all really appreciate you, being part of this discussion. I know for me, My opinion has changed over the years. I realize now, how much of a bubble, like over the years as I got older, I realized how much of a bubble I was in terms of my understanding of the of the conflict. So thank you again for joining us and giving us your perspective. And just to end our call for tonight, if a couple folks just two or three folks just want to talk about maybe some best practices, things we can do to help back in Afghanistan, the folks that are in Afghanistan, or maybe it's folks here, what are some action steps or things that we need to do to address some of these things that we were talking about? Nurajan, did you still want to start us off, or?
Yeah, sure. I think for me, the one thing that Habib John brought up is when we think about Afghanistan, there is concern and tension about really genuinely wanting to go and assist and uplift as opposed to going to take and profit, right? And there are best practices that other communities have invested in. So if we think of the Armenian-American community, they're a tiny community, I would say arguably smaller than us. They picked one specific item, holding Turkey accountable to the Armenian genocide, and they have pushed that on Congress. And Congress is a very sort of rational institution, which only, they really put the pressure on. Congress will only sort of take you seriously if there's something in it for them, right? And the Armenian American community made sure that their congressmen pushed the agenda for them, right? So as Afghans, if we are to take seriously the fact that we had a brain drain and we brought, the educated professionals from Afghanistan to the U.S. and Europe, there is a lot of collective education, money, resources, power to really push a specific item forward to Congress, to the political structures that we're involved in. And I think that it does require us to put our egos aside and pick one specific agenda item and push it forward. And that, again, because of the different visions we have, may be harder to do. But we've seen it happen with the Armenian American community. And I'm really hopeful that if there's a way that we can sort of pick best practices from other minority communities, we can influence foreign policy for the sake of Afghans and Afghanistan, and not necessarily for the sake of us benefiting more as Afghan-Americans.
Let's go to Lema and then we'll go to Reza.
So I've asked all of my Afghan friends from Afghanistan the same question that Medina and Gina and other people and all of us on this panel have, which is, what can we do from here to help? And I've gotten multiple answers, including what Habib John said. And, one person who's a journalist said, raise awareness in America. In the U.S., do as much as you can here, and that will help us abroad. And so, John said it perfectly, this idea of lobbying and congregating together and having a single initiative, I think, is a perfect example. And being, working in local, state, and with federal Congress members, it's a lot easier if you have a unified mission together and you are consistent. And they see that. But right now, they see our diaspora community as extremely fragmented and untrustworthy because we say something and then we don't follow through. So once we get to a point where we can create a collective goal and a program of how to implement it, we can make it happen. And so I echo her sentiments on what we can do from here, which is be loud and vocal and together in a mission.
There is a John.
I want to just echo Sarajan and Nurajan and Limajan's points. But I also want to place emphasis on the good work that we're doing here, right now at 9:23 p.m. Pacific time. The thing is, we are, at least I haven't seen a group of Afghans, young, come together with a singular purpose to speak about these issues. This isn't just talking at each other or talking across each other. We're discussing in a respectful, sanguine way how to fix, how to help the people in Afghanistan and the people here. And it's this kind of work, this kind of what may seem minuscule work that we're doing right here together that is going to build that foundation for putting aside our egos, for putting in contact people who may not have been in contact with each other beforehand, and giving them a face to put onto the name so that they can say, hey, you know what? this person had a really great idea. I think I want to email them, talk to them, coordinate, right? We are building resources. Many of us are in graduate programs, and we're building sort of credibility within not just the outside community, but within our community as well, with very expensive pieces of paper that will allow us to have a knowledge base to put our ideas into action. And so if you want to talk about affecting change and changing narratives, I think that that kind of stuff happens here, where we're discussing together something that is important to us and networking and creating a path towards the achievable goals that we are seeking. So I don't think that I don't think any of you are discounting it, but I just wanted to mention it and put it in the YouTube video for posterity. This is the kind of bold will that Nangila John was talking about on the Facebook page that will help push our Afghan-American and our Afghan communities forward.
I can go quickly while Omar is out. As an Afghan-American, that I'm kind of the opposite of Habib, right? He was an Afghan that grew up in Afghanistan and now lives in America. I went to Afghanistan, and my experience was that what it taught me was to be very careful as Afghans living in the diaspora to not internalize the message about Afghanistan that we read in the media. What we read in the media, what we hear in the media is a very orientalistic presentation of Afghanistan, very inaccurate. When you go to Afghanistan and you see the people who live there, it's amazing. The way I explain it is that, yes, okay, the society was destroyed. It's been completely torn apart. But that means that everyone who you see in Afghanistan has a plan. They're all a hustler. They all have a vision for their future, and I've never seen that anywhere else in the world. So that kind of forward thinking, optimism, that kind of everyone in Afghanistan, 75% of Afghanistan is under 30 years old, right? So they're tired of this war, and we have this opportunity to move on. We have hope, and we as Afghan Americans, as Afghan diaspora, can help lead that on. So question that orientalistic narrative and just be hopeful. That's my message.
And Soraya, John?
Yeah, just to first of all, great points, and I completely agree with the last people who just spoke. But if we're going to be building a movement, again, I just like to reiterate that everyone is going to have a different vision, and it's extremely important for us to accept that, because it's okay. But also to reiterate what Lema said, we should have consistent goals and consistent structure, but also be able to accept and respect our differences and give everyone's ideas a chance for growth and to be able to support it, because like I said, we don't have enough solidarity within our community. And when the movement gets big enough, we may face some roadblocks and experience maybe even power struggles. It's something I had seen myself with other Afghan-led movements. So to be aware of that and to be prepared for when it does happen, so we know how to deal with it, overcome it, and then be able to move forward.
And Habib John, I'd like you to kind of close us out for tonight.
I would like to make one very important point about what diaspora can do, Afghan diaspora. And I hope I don't sound or come across very disrespectful to Afghan Americans and Afghan Europeans. I just ask you guys, the young generation, to take away your parents' computers, iPads, and iPhones from them, because some of the things that they write and some of the things that they put as a video about, like Sunni versus Shia, Pashtun versus Tajik, that really hurts us. And that if you guys could just talk to the older generation and convince them to stop just funding that division, ethnic division and lingual division, that will help us a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight's call. Sorry for the technical difficulties earlier. Hopefully, everyone learned something out of this discussion. We'll be posting a link to our YouTube channel. So I know we had some broken links during this talk. So just go to the YouTube channel, and it'll be posted, all the videos, and you can watch them there and watch some of the old ones as well. But thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and hope you all have a good night.